A compassionate young teen, Alex, helps an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Parker, by fixing her broken TV. He thinks his simple act of kindness is complete until the next day when Mrs. Parker arrives at his house with a police officer. What unfolds next takes Alex by surprise and changes his life forever. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oak Ridge. Birds chirped lazily in the trees, and the soft hum of lawnmowers filled the air as Alex Turner pedaled his bike down the street. The 15-year-old teen loved these rides, using them as a way to unwind after school. The warm breeze tugged at his shirt, and he smiled as he passed familiar houses and waved to neighbors. As he turned the corner onto Maple Lane, something unusual caught his eye. In the front yard of a small yellow house with neatly trimmed hedges, an elderly woman was hunched over an old television set. The scene looked out of place. Her flower-lined yard was usually a picture of peace and order, but now it had been disrupted by the bulky TV sitting awkwardly on the grass. The woman, Mrs. Evelyn Parker, seemed flustered as she fiddled with the knobs, her brow furrowed in frustration. Alex slowed his bike, concern etched on his face. He had known Mrs. Parker for as long as he could remember. She was the quiet neighbor who always smiled warmly when he passed by and sometimes gave him cookies when he helped carry her groceries. But in recent months, Alex had noticed she seemed quieter, more withdrawn. The roses she so lovingly tended in her garden looked less vibrant, as if they missed her touch. "Hey, Mrs. Parker," Alex called out as he approached, parking his bike by the sidewalk. "Is everything okay?" Startled, Mrs. Parker looked up. Her weathered face lit up with a faint smile when she saw him. "Oh, Alex," she said, her voice tinged with both relief and embarrassment. "This old TV of mine has finally decided to give up the ghost, and I have no idea what to do with it." Alex stepped closer, examining the television. It looked ancient, the kind you'd see in old movies, with its bulky frame and dials instead of buttons. "What happened to it?" he asked. "I was just trying to watch my afternoon show," Mrs. Parker explained, gesturing helplessly at the lifeless screen. "It flickered a bit and then... nothing. I thought maybe I could fix it, but I think I'm just making things worse." Alex crouched beside the TV, inspecting it with curiosity. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. Mrs. Parker's face softened and she let out a small chuckle. "If you think you can make sense of this old thing, be my guest." Alex smiled, pulling a small multi-tool from his backpack. Electronics had always fascinated him, and he loved figuring out how things worked. He carefully unplugged the TV and began tinkering with the back panel, checking the cords and connections. Mrs. Parker stood nearby, wringing her hands nervously. "You don't have to do this, Alex," she said. "I'm sure you've got better things to do than fuss with an old lady's TV." Alex glanced up at her, his expression earnest. "It's no trouble, Mrs. Parker. Besides, I like fixing things." As he worked, Mrs. Parker watched in amazement. Alex's fingers moved deftly, and his brow furrowed in concentration. It reminded her of her late husband, Henry, who had always been good with his hands. A pang of nostalgia filled her chest, but it was accompanied by a sense of gratitude for the young man before her. After a few minutes, Alex sat back on his heels, brushing dust from his hands. "I think I found the problem," he said. "There's a loose wire here. Let me just..." He reconnected the wire, plugged the TV back in, and pressed the power button. The screen crackled to life, filling with a clear picture. Mrs. Parker gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh, Alex," she exclaimed, clapping her hands together in delight. "You fixed it. I can't believe it." Alex grinned, a mix of pride and relief washing over him. "It wasn't too hard," he said modestly. "Just needed a little TLC." Mrs. Parker's eyes glistened with tears as she looked at Alex. "You have no idea how much this means to me," she said softly. "This old TV, it was a gift from Henry. He bought it for me on our 25th wedding anniversary so we could watch our favorite shows together. I thought I'd lost it forever." Alex felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how much the TV meant to her, and knowing he'd been able to restore something so precious filled him with a deep sense of fulfillment. Mrs. Parker's face brightened with an idea. "Oh, I know just how to thank you," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "Come inside. I baked some cookies this morning, and I'd love for you to have some." Alex's eyes lit up. "Cookies? That sounds amazing." The two made their way into the cozy yellow house where the smell of freshly baked cookies lingered in the air. Mrs. Parker set a plate of chocolate chip cookies on the kitchen table, along with a glass of cold milk. Alex took a bite, his face lighting up with delight. "These are incredible, Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice muffled by the mouthful of cookie. Mrs. Parker chuckled, her laughter light and genuine. "I'm so glad you like them. It's been a long time since I've baked for anyone." As they sat and chatted, Mrs. Parker shared stories about her late husband and their life together. She spoke of his kindness, his dedication to helping others, and the joy they'd shared in the little things. Alex listened intently, feeling a newfound appreciation for the woman sitting across from him. When the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, Alex stood to leave. "Thanks for the cookies, Mrs. Parker," he said, smiling. "And if your TV ever acts up again, just let me know." Mrs. Parker reached out and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Alex," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're a very special young man. Your parents must be so proud of you." As Alex pedaled home, the warmth of Mrs. Parker's words stayed with him. He realized that helping her had made him feel something he couldn't quite put into words, a sense of purpose, of connection. He hadn't just fixed a TV that day, he'd brought a little light back into her life. The following morning, Alex Turner woke up feeling a sense of pride from the previous day's good deed. Fixing Mrs. Parker's TV hadn't just been an act of kindness, it had also reminded him how satisfying it was to help someone in need. He got dressed quickly, eager to get outside and enjoy the sunny weekend. The day started like any other. Alex rode his bike around the neighborhood, stopping by the park to shoot hoops with his friends. As the sun climbed higher, he decided to head home for lunch. He coasted into his driveway, leaning his bike against the garage, and stepped inside the house. "Hey, Mom," Alex called as he kicked off his sneakers. "What's for lunch?" His mother, a cheerful woman with a warm smile, appeared from the kitchen. "Grilled cheese and tomato soup," she replied. "How was your morning?" "Pretty good," Alex said, grabbing a glass of water. "I played basketball with the guys. Oh, and yesterday I helped Mrs. Parker fix her TV. She was so happy." "That's wonderful, Alex," his mom said, her face lighting up with pride. "She's such a sweet lady. I'm glad you were able to help her." As Alex sat down to eat, the Schaff-Paying pulling into the driveway caught his attention. A moment later, there was a knock at the door. His mother glanced at him curiously. "Are you expecting anyone?" Alex shook his head, swallowing a bite of his sandwich. "Nope." She went to answer the door while Alex continued eating, only half paying attention. But when he heard a firm, unfamiliar voice, his curiosity piqued. He set down his sandwich and walked toward the front door. Standing on the porch was Mrs. Parker, looking nervous but determined, and next to her was a tall man in a police uniform. His badge gleamed in the sunlight, and his expression was serious, but not unfriendly. "Mrs. Parker?" Alex asked, confusion flickering across his face. "What's going on?" "Hello, Alex," Mrs. Parker said, her voice trembling slightly. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I needed to speak with you and your family." Alex's mom, sensing the tension, invited them inside. "Please come in," she said. "Would you like something to drink?" "No, thank you," Mrs. Parker replied, stepping into the living room. The officer followed, nodding politely at Alex and his mother. Alex's dad, who had been reading the newspaper, looked up from his chair. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone calm but curious. Mrs. Parker took a deep breath, clutching her purse tightly. "I want to start by saying how grateful I am to Alex," she began, her eyes flicking toward him with warmth. "Yesterday, he went out of his way to help me fix my TV. It was such a kind gesture, and it meant the world to me." Alex shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where this was going. "It was nothing, really," he mumbled. "I just wanted to help." Mrs. Parker smiled at him, her eyes brimming with emotion. It wasn't nothing, Alex, it was everything. She paused, her expression growing more serious. But when I was watching the news last night, something happened that made me think about what you did and why it was so important. The officer, who had been standing silently beside her, stepped forward. Mrs. Parker came to the station this morning, he explained. She told us about her interaction with Alex and how much it meant to her. But she also shared something else, something she's been struggling with for a long time. Mrs. Parker nodded, her hands trembling slightly. You see, Alex, ever since Henry passed away, I've felt invisible, like I don't matter anymore. People pass me by without a second glance, and I've gotten used to being alone. But yesterday, when you stopped to help me, it reminded me of something my husband used to say. Her voice broke for a moment, and she pressed a hand to her mouth before continuing. He always said that kindness is the glue that holds a community together. And yesterday, you proved him right. Alex's parents exchanged a glance, their expressions softening with understanding. Alex, still unsure of what to say, simply nodded, his throat tight with emotion. But that's not all, Mrs. Parker said, her voice growing firmer. I realize that while I've been feeling invisible, I've also been hiding parts of my story that I think need to be shared. That's why I brought Officer Ramirez here today. The officer stepped forward again, his gaze steady and kind. Mrs. Parker wanted me to share a bit about her late husband, Henry, he said. Henry Parker was one of the most respected officers in our precinct. He dedicated his life to serving this community, and he always went above and beyond to help those in need. Alex's mom placed a hand on her heart, visibly moved. I had no idea, she said softly. Henry believed in the power of connection, Mrs. Parker continued. He used to say that even the smallest act of kindness could create ripples that changed lives. And yesterday, Alex, you created one of those ripples. Alex felt his cheeks flush. I just fixed a TV, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Parker shook her head, her expression resolute. You did so much more than that. You reminded me that I'm not alone, that people still care. And that's why I'm here today. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to Alex. This is something Henry and I always talked about doing, creating a scholarship fund for young people who make a difference in their community. I wasn't sure how to start, but after meeting you, I knew it was time. Alex stared at the envelope, stunned. Mrs. Parker, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, dear, Mrs. Parker said, her voice warm. Just keep being the kind, thoughtful person you already are. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Finally, Alex's dad spoke, his voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Parker, what you're doing is incredible. Thank you for seeing the good in our son. Mrs. Parker smiled, her gaze softening. It's not hard to see. Alex has a heart as big as Henry's, and I have no doubt he'll do great things. As Mrs. Parker and Officer Ramirez left, Atex sat down, still holding the envelope in his hands. His mind raced with thoughts about the unexpected visit and the impact his small act of kindness had made. That night, as Alex lay in bed, he replayed Mrs. Parker's words in his mind. He realized that kindness wasn't just about helping someone in the moment, it was about creating connections, building trust, and reminding people that they mattered. And in that moment, Alex decided he would carry forward the lesson Mrs. Parker had shared, ensuring that the ripples of kindness continued to spread. The day after Mrs. Parker and Officer Ramirez's visit, Alex woke up earlier than usual. The previous day's events lingered in his mind, filling him with a mix of pride and responsibility. He kept replaying Mrs. Parker's words, particularly her comment about the ripples of kindness. It made him think, if a simple act like fixing a TV could mean so much, what else could he do to make a difference? Alex got ready quickly, slipping the envelope Mrs. Parker had given him into his backpack. He wasn't sure when he'd have the courage to open it, but he wanted to keep it close as a reminder of the unexpected connections his actions had sparked. After breakfast, Alex decided to pay Mrs. Parker another visit. As he approached her house, he noticed her sitting on the porch, a mug of tea in her hands. The morning sun cast a warm glow over her, highlighting the gentle smile that appeared when she saw him. "Good morning, Mrs. Parker," Alex called, waving as he walked up the driveway. "Good morning, Alex," she replied, her voice warm and welcoming. "What a pleasant surprise to see you again so soon." Alex climbed the porch steps, feeling a sense of comfort in her presence. "I just wanted to check in," he said, "and maybe say thank you for everything yesterday." Mrs. Parker's smile widened and she gestured to the chair beside her. "Come, sit down. I'm glad you stopped by." As Alex took a seat, he glanced at the small garden to the side of the porch where vibrant roses bloomed. "Your garden looks amazing," he said, genuinely impressed. "You must spend a lot of time out here." "Oh, I do," Mrs. Parker said with a chuckle. "It's my little sanctuary. Henry always said I had a way with flowers. He'd tease that I could probably grow a rose bush on a rock." Alex laughed, picturing the kind man Mrs. Parker had spoken so fondly of. "It sounds like he was really proud of you." Mrs. Parker's expression softened and she took a sip of her tea. "He was," she said, "and I was proud of him too. He had such a big heart, Alex, just like you." The compliment made Alex blush, but he couldn't help feeling a surge of pride. "I'm just trying to help," he said modestly. "And that's what makes you special," Mrs. Parker said, placing her hand gently on his. "Never underestimate the power of simply showing up for others." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, enjoying the crisp morning air. Then Mrs. Parker stood, her movements deliberate and purposeful. "Wait here, Alex. I have something for you." Before Alex could protest, she disappeared inside the house. He waited, curiosity bubbling in his chest. When she returned, she was holding a small wooden box, worn but polished with care. She placed it on the table between them and took a deep breath. "This belonged to Henry," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "It's a keepsake he cherished deeply, and I'd like you to have it." Alex stared at the box, his heart pounding. "Mrs. Parker, I can't—" "Please, Alex," she interrupted gently, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It would mean so much to me to pass this on to someone who embodies the same values Henry held dear." With trembling hands, Alex opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of navy velvet, was a silver badge. It gleamed in the sunlight, its surface engraved with the words, "To serve and protect." Alex's breath caught as he realized the significance of the gift. This is his badge," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Parker nodded, a proud smile breaking through her tears. "It's the badge he wore every day as an officer. It represents everything he stood for: integrity, kindness, and community." Alex looked up at her, overwhelmed by the gesture. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his throat tight with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Mrs. Parker replied, her voice steady. "Just promise me you'll continue to live by those principles. Let this badge remind you of the power you hold to make a difference." Alex nodded, his eyes glistening as he carefully closed the box. "I promise," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'll do my best to honor his legacy." They spent the rest of the morning talking, with Mrs. Parker sharing stories about Henry's time on the force. Alex listened intently, soaking up every word and feeling a deeper connection to the man he had never met, but now deeply admired. As Alex left Mrs. Parker's house later that day, the wooden box tucked safely in his backpack, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced before. He thought about the ripple effect Mrs. Parker had mentioned and realized that he was now a part of something much bigger than himself. That evening, Alex sat at the dining table with his parents, recounting the morning's events. He pulled out the box and showed them the badge, his voice trembling as he explained its significance. His mother's eyes filled with tears as she gently ran her fingers over the engraved words. "This is such an incredible gift, Alex," she said. "You've made such a difference in Mrs. Parker's life." His father nodded, his expression serious but proud. "You've taken on a responsibility, son," he said. "Carrying forward Henry's legacy is no small thing, but I know you're up to the task." Alex looked at his parents, feeling their unwavering support, and nodded. "I'll do my best," he promised. "I want to make both of you and Mrs. Parker proud." As he headed to bed that night, Alex placed the wooden box on his bedside table. The badge seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, a silent reminder of the promise he had made. He lay down, his mind racing with ideas of how he could live up to the values it represented. In the quiet of his room, Alex whispered to himself, "I'll make a difference. One small act at a time." And with that, he closed his eyes, his heart full of hope for the future. The following weekend, Alex decided to do something special to honor Mrs. Parker and the legacy of her late husband, Officer Henry Parker. Inspired by the stories she shared about Henry's dedication to helping others, Alex came up with an idea that would bring the community together, a neighborhood cleanup day. On Saturday morning, Alex woke up with excitement buzzing through him. He had spent the past few days making flyers with the help of his parents, posting them on bulletin boards at the community center, local cafes, and even handing them out at school. The response had been encouraging, with many people expressing interest in helping. Dressed in comfortable clothes and armed with a clipboard, Alex headed to the park where the cleanup would start. Mrs. Parker was already there, sitting on a bench with a thermos of tea and a warm smile on her face. "Good morning, Alex," she greeted as he approached. "It's such a beautiful day for this." "Morning, Mrs. Parker," Alex replied, his heart swelling at her support. "Thanks for coming so early. I wasn't sure how many people would actually show up." Mrs. Parker chuckled softly. "You've got more influence than you realize, young man. I'm sure they'll come." As if on cue, people began trickling in. First, a few of Alex's school friends arrived carrying gloves and trash bags. Then came neighbors, families with young children, and even some of Mrs. Parker's friends from her gardening club. By 10 a.m., the park was bustling with volunteers, all chatting and getting ready for the day's work. Alex stepped onto a small picnic table to address the group, feeling a mix of nervousness and pride. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "Thank you all for coming today. This cleanup is about more than just picking up trash. It's about showing that we care for our community and each other. Let's work together to make this neighborhood a place we're proud to call home." The crowd cheered and Alex felt a surge of confidence. He jumped down from the table and joined the group, handing out supplies and organizing everyone into teams to cover different areas of the park. The cleanup started in earnest, with people spreading out across the park to pick up litter, pull weeds, and even plant flowers in neglected garden beds. Alex worked alongside his friends, who teased him about being the boss, but their smiles showed they were proud of him. Mrs. Parker moved among the volunteers, offering words of encouragement and sharing stories about her late husband. "Henry would have loved to see this," she said to a young mother planting flowers with her daughter. "He always believed in the power of community." At one point, Officer Ramirez arrived, his uniform neat and his demeanor warm. He waved at Alex, who ran over to greet him. "Officer Ramirez, thanks for coming," Alex said, beaming. "I wouldn't miss it," the officer replied. "This is a wonderful thing you're doing, Alex. It reminds me of Henry. He was always organizing events like this." Hearing those words filled Alex with a deep sense of pride. He introduced Officer Ramirez to the other volunteers, many of whom were eager to hear stories about Henry and his dedication to the neighborhood. As the hours passed, the park transformed. The once littered pathways sparkled clean, the flower beds burst with color, and the playground equipment gleamed after being scrubbed down. Volunteers worked tirelessly, pausing only for water breaks and the occasional chat. Near lunchtime, Alex's parents arrived, carrying coolers filled with sandwiches and drinks for the volunteers. The group gathered under the shade of a large oak tree to eat and share stories. Laughter and conversation filled the air, and Alex couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment as he looked around at the smiling faces. "Alex," Mrs. Parker said, her voice carrying a mix of pride and emotion, "this is exactly the kind of thing Henry believed in. He'd be so proud of you." Alex smiled shyly, his cheeks turning red. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mrs. Parker. You inspired me to do this." After lunch, the cleanup continued with renewed energy. A group of kids worked together to paint a mural on the side of a storage shed in the park, their artwork depicting scenes of nature and community. Alex helped guide them, making sure everyone had a chance to contribute. As the day wound down, Alex gathered everyone near the mural for a group photo. Mrs. Parker stood proudly beside him, her eyes shining with tears of joy. The crowd cheered as Alex held up a thumbs up for the camera, capturing the moment of triumph. Later that evening, as Alex sat with Mrs. Parker on her porch, the two reflected on the day's success. The air was filled with the chirping of crickets and the soft rustling of leaves. "You did something incredible today, Alex," Mrs. Parker said, her voice warm with pride. "You brought people together in a way that Henry always dreamed of, and you did it with kindness and determination." Alex looked at her, his heart full. "I just wanted to make a difference," he said, "but I think I ended up learning so much more from everyone else." Mrs. Parker reached over and patted his hand. "That's the beauty of community, Alex. When we come together, we all grow stronger." As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Alex felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The cleanup day wasn't just about the park. It was about the connections they had formed, the stories they had shared, and the legacy they were building together. For the first time, Alex truly understood the ripple effect of kindness, and he vowed to carry it forward, one act at a time. The success of the neighborhood cleanup spread quickly throughout the community. By the following week, Alex was the talk of Maple Street. Neighbors who hadn't participated in the cleanup stopped him during his bike rides to congratulate him and express interest in joining future events. Mrs. Parker, beaming with pride, often shared the story of Alex's leadership during her visits to the local market or the gardening club. Alex, however, remained humble. "It wasn't just me," he told anyone who praised him. "Everyone came together to make it happen." One evening, as Alex and Mrs. Parker sat on her porch watching the sunset, she turned to him with an idea. "You know, Alex," she began, her voice thoughtful, "what you did with the cleanup day, bringing people together like that, it reminded me of the community initiatives Henry used to organize. I think you have a gift for this sort of thing." Alex looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Parker smiled, her face lighting up. "You have the ability to inspire people. I think you could do more than just one event. What if we started a program for the neighborhood, something that could make a lasting impact?" Alex's eyes widened as the idea began to take shape in his mind. "Like a community club?" "Exactly," Mrs. Parker said, her voice filled with excitement. "We could organize events, help neighbors in need, and even work on projects to improve the area. We could call it something like the Helping Hands Club." Alex grinned. "I love that. Let's do it." The next day, Alex dove into action. He created a simple flyer with the help of his mom, listing ideas for the club and inviting anyone interested to attend the first meeting at the community center. Mrs. Parker helped distribute the flyers during her errands, and Alex passed them out to his classmates and neighbors. The response was overwhelming. When the day of the meeting arrived, the community center was filled with people of all ages. Alex stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding with nerves. Mrs. Parker sat in the front row, her reassuring smile giving him courage. "Thank you all for coming," Alex began, his voice a little shaky at first. "The Helping Hands Club is about bringing our community together to make a difference. Whether it's organizing more cleanups, helping our elderly neighbors, or creating programs for kids, there's something for everyone to do." The crowd clapped, and Alex felt a surge of confidence. He began taking suggestions from the attendees, writing them down on a large whiteboard. Ideas flowed freely: a monthly food drive, a tutoring program for struggling students, and even a neighborhood watch group to keep everyone safe. Within weeks, the Helping Hands Club was fully operational. Every Saturday morning, a group of volunteers gathered to work on the chosen project of the week. One week, they helped repair the fence of an elderly couple down the street. Another week, they organized a clothing drive for families in need. Mrs. Parker often joined in, her presence a source of inspiration for everyone. One project that particularly excited Alex was building a small community garden in the park. "Mrs. Parker, you've got to help with this one," Alex said one afternoon as he explained the plan to her. "Your roses are the best on the street." Mrs. Parker chuckled. "I'd be honored, Alex. Let's teach everyone a thing or two about gardening." The community garden became a centerpiece for the neighborhood with vibrant flowers, fresh vegetables, and even a little bench where people could sit and enjoy the beauty around them. It was a symbol of what the Helping Hands Club stood for: growth, connection, and shared effort. As the club grew, Alex began to notice a change in the neighborhood. People who had once been strangers were now friends. Kids played together in the park, and neighbors looked out for one another. Mrs. Parker, who had spent so much time alone after her husband's passing, now had a constant stream of visitors and invitations to events. One afternoon, Alex and Mrs. Parker sat in the garden they had helped create, admiring the fruits of their labor. "Do you see what you've done, Alex?" Mrs. Parker said, her voice filled with pride. "You've brought this community back to life." Alex smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mrs. Parker. You've taught me so much." Mrs. Parker reached over and patted his hand. "And you've taught me that it's never too late to make a difference." One crisp autumn evening, the Helping Hands Club held a special meeting to celebrate its success. Alex was surprised to see Officer Ramirez walk into the room with a box in his hands. The officer smiled as he approached Alex and Mrs. Parker. "This," Officer Ramirez said, placing the box on the table, "is something that belonged to Henry. Mrs. Parker and I thought it was time it found a new home." Alex carefully opened the box to reveal a plaque engraved with the words, "For outstanding service to the community." It had been awarded to Officer Henry Parker years ago for his contributions to the neighborhood. Mrs. Parker's eyes glistened with tears as she spoke. "Henry would want you to have this, Alex. You've carried on his legacy in ways I could never have imagined." Alex was speechless. He ran his fingers over the plaque, feeling its weight not just in his hands but in his heart. "Thank you," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll do my best to honor this." As the evening drew to a close, Alex stood up to address the group. He held the plaque in his hands, his voice steady and full of conviction. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about all of us. What we've built here together is something special, and it's just the beginning. Let's keep growing, keep helping, and keep making this neighborhood the best it can be." The room erupted in applause, and Alex glanced at Mrs. Parker, who nodded at him with pride. He knew that the ripple effect of kindness they had created would continue to spread, touching more lives and inspiring others to join their mission. At that moment, Alex felt a deep sense of purpose. The Helping Hands Club wasn't just a project anymore, it was a movement, one that would carry on for generations. And it all started with a simple act of kindness, a young boy helping an elderly woman fix her TV. The Helping Hands Club had become a cornerstone of the Maple Street community. The once quiet neighborhood now buzzed with energy and purpose, thanks to Alex's initiative and Mrs. Parker's wisdom. Their latest project, a monthly mentorship program, aimed to pair local teenagers with elderly residents to foster cross-generational connections and skill sharing. Mrs. Parker watched with pride as Alex addressed a group of neighbors in the community center. His voice was clear and confident, a far cry from the shy boy who had first approached her with an offer to fix her TV. "Our mentorship program isn't just about learning skills," Alex explained. "It's about building relationships, learning from one another, and creating bonds that make our community stronger." The crowd applauded, their faces alight with enthusiasm. Mrs. Parker smiled, knowing Alex had found his calling. The mentorship program's first event was a resounding success. Held in the community garden, the event paired teens with elderly mentors who taught them a variety of skills. Mrs. Parker led a gardening workshop, showing a group of teens how to prune rose bushes and care for delicate plants. "Gently like this," Mrs. Parker said, guiding a young girl's hand with the shears. "Plants are a lot like people. They thrive when treated with patience and care." Nearby, Mr. Jenkins taught a group of boys how to repair old bicycles, while another mentor demonstrated the art of knitting. Laughter and chatter filled the air, and Alex moved between groups, offering encouragement and taking notes for future improvements. By the end of the day, the participants were beaming. One teen, a boy named Marcus, approached Alex. "Thanks for doing this," he said shyly. "I never knew how much I could learn from older people. Mrs. Parker's stories about her husband were amazing." Alex grinned. "I'm glad you liked it. There's so much wisdom in our community, and it's great to share it." Word of the Helping Hands Club spread beyond Maple Street. A local newspaper featured a story about their initiatives, highlighting the mentorship program and the impact it had on the neighborhood. The article described how Alex, with guidance from Mrs. Parker, had created a movement that was transforming lives. Shortly after, the mayor's office reached out with an invitation for Alex and Mrs. Parker to attend a town council meeting. The council wanted to recognize their contributions and discuss how similar programs could be implemented in other neighborhoods. At the meeting, Alex stood nervously before the council, but Mrs. Parker's reassuring nod from the front row gave him courage. He spoke about the importance of community, the power of kindness, and how small actions could lead to big changes. "It all started with fixing a TV," Alex said, smiling at Mrs. Parker. "Sometimes the smallest gestures can spark something much bigger." The council members applauded, and the mayor presented Alex and Mrs. Parker with a certificate of recognition for their outstanding contributions to the community. The room erupted in applause, and Alex felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just his achievement. It belonged to everyone who had come together to make Maple Street a better place. Inspired by the recognition, Alex and Mrs. Parker began brainstorming ways to expand their efforts. One of their ideas was to establish a scholarship fund in Officer Henry Parker's name. The fund would provide financial support to local students pursuing higher education or vocational training. "We can't stop here," Alex said during one of their planning sessions. "There are so many ways we can help people just like Henry did." Mrs. Parker's eyes shone with pride. "Henry would be so proud of you, Alex. This scholarship fund will carry his legacy forward, just like the Helping Hands Club." They organized a fundraiser at the community center, complete with a bake sale, live music, and a silent auction. Residents donated homemade goods, services, and even a few prized possessions to support the cause. The turnout was incredible, and by the end of the night they had raised enough money to award scholarships to several deserving students. Through his work with the Helping Hands Club, Alex grew in ways he never anticipated. He became a leader, a problem solver, and a source of inspiration for others. His grades improved as he learned to manage his time and channel his energy into meaningful projects. Teachers and classmates began to notice the change in him, and he often found himself at the center of school discussions about community involvement. One day, his teacher pulled him aside after class. "Alex, you've shown incredible growth this year," she said. "Have you considered applying for leadership programs? I think you'd be an excellent candidate." Alex nodded thoughtfully. "I'll think about it. Thanks, Mrs. Taylor." But in his heart, Alex knew where his true passion lay, right here in his community, building connections and making a difference. As spring approached, the Helping Hands Club hosted a community festival to celebrate their achievements and bring everyone together. The festival featured food stalls, games, and performances by local talent. Alex and Mrs. Parker worked tirelessly to organize the event, enlisting the help of club members and neighbors. On the day of the festival, Maple Street was alive with activity. Families strolled through the garden, teens showed off their new skills, and elders shared stories in a designated storytelling corner. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the scent of delicious food. As the sun set, Alex took the stage to address the crowd. With Mrs. Parker standing beside him, he spoke from the heart. "This festival is a celebration of what we've accomplished together," Alex said, his voice steady and full of emotion. "It's proof that when we come together as a community, we can achieve amazing things. Let's keep growing, learning, and helping each other." The crowd erupted in applause, and Alex felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He glanced at Mrs. Parker, who was smiling proudly, her eyes shining with tears. As the festival wound down, Alex and Mrs. Parker sat together under the twinkling lights strung across the garden. They watched as neighbors laughed, hugged, and made plans for future projects. "This is just the beginning," Alex said, his voice filled with determination. "There's so much more we can do." Mrs. Parker nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "I know you'll carry this spirit with you, Alex, wherever life takes you. And remember, I'll always be here cheering you on." In that moment, Alex realized that their bond, forged through kindness and shared purpose, would last a lifetime. Together, they had sown the seeds of change, not just for Maple Street, but for everyone they touched. And those seeds would continue to grow, creating a legacy of hope, unity, and love. Years passed, and Maple Street became a vibrant symbol of community and resilience. Alex, now a young adult, had followed his passion for helping others into a career in community organizing. His name was synonymous with the Helping Hands Club, which had grown into a citywide initiative, transforming neighborhoods with mentorship programs, youth scholarships, and outreach efforts for the elderly. Today, he found himself walking the familiar streets of his childhood, this time as a guest of honor at Westbrook High's alumni gathering. The event was special, not just for reconnecting with old friends, but for celebrating a shared legacy. Among the speakers was Alex, invited to reflect on the journey that had started with a simple act of kindness. The school gymnasium buzzed with excitement, decorated with banners, streamers, and photo displays chronicling the achievements of alumni. At the center of the exhibit stood a large poster board dedicated to Alex and the Helping Hands Club, featuring photos of events, articles highlighting its success, and thank you notes from community members. As Alex walked in, memories of his teenage years flooded back. The struggles, the triumphs, and, most vividly, the day he met Mrs. Parker. His heart swelled with gratitude. If it weren't for her, he wouldn't be standing here, a changed man with a purpose. A familiar voice called out, breaking his reverie. "Alex!" He turned to see Marcus, a former mentee from the mentorship program, now a college student studying social work. They hugged, laughing and catching up before Marcus gestured toward the stage. "Everyone's waiting for you. You're the highlight of tonight." Alex smiled, feeling equal parts humbled and nervous. "Let's make it memorable, then." The room quieted as Alex took the stage. He paused for a moment, scanning the crowd. Teachers, classmates, and neighbors from Maple Street sat alongside former Helping Hands Club members and volunteers. Among them was Mrs. Parker, now older but as radiant as ever, sitting in the front row with a proud smile. Alex began, his voice steady and filled with emotion. "When I was younger, I thought changing the world was something only big heroes did. I never imagined that fixing a TV for a neighbor could set off a chain of events that would transform not just my life, but our community." He shared the story of meeting Mrs. Parker, the lessons she had taught him, and how the Helping Hands Club was born. "Mrs. Parker didn't just teach me how to repair electronics. She taught me how to repair connections, how to nurture hope, and how to build a stronger community." The audience hung on every word, many nodding in agreement, some dabbing at their eyes. Alex continued, recounting how the club's initiatives had brought people together, fostered understanding, and provided opportunities for those who needed it most. "Kindness isn't just about helping someone once," he said. "It's about planting seeds that grow into something far greater than you ever imagined." After his speech, the floor was opened for reflections. One by one, people stood to share how the Helping Hands Club had impacted their lives. A former mentee spoke first. "I was a shy kid with no confidence until Alex and Mrs. Parker paired me with Mr. Jenkins for a mentorship program. He taught me carpentry, but more importantly, he believed in me. Now I'm a carpenter with my own business, thank you." Another person, a young woman named Lydia, shared her story. "My family struggled when I was in high school. The scholarship fund the club created helped me go to college. I wouldn't be here without it." Finally, Mrs. Parker stood, her movement slower but her voice strong. The room hushed as she addressed the crowd. "I never imagined," she began, "that a broken TV would bring so much joy and purpose into my life. Alex came into my home as a boy with a big heart, and he's grown into a man who's made an indelible mark on this world." She turned to Alex, her eyes glistening. "You've made me proud in ways I can't even begin to describe. But more than that, You've shown everyone here that kindness is contagious, that even the smallest actions can ripple out and change lives. Thank you for letting me be a part of your journey." The room erupted into applause, and Alex felt tears prick his eyes. He walked down to Mrs. Parker, embraced her tightly, and whispered, "Thank you for believing in me." Later that night, as Alex and Mrs. Parker walked back to Maple Street, they paused in front of her home. The porch light illuminated the familiar sight of her beloved garden, now blooming with flowers that mirrored the vibrancy of their community. "Do you think Henry would be proud of us?" Alex asked quietly. Mrs. Parker placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes soft with emotion. "Oh, Alex, he would be over the moon. But more than that, I think he'd be proud of the person you've become. You've carried forward his belief in the power of kindness, and you've made it your own." Alex smiled, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you." Mrs. Parker shook her head. "No, Alex. You had it in you all along. I just gave you a little nudge." As Alex walked home, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. It wasn't just about fixing a TV or starting a club. It was about creating a legacy of love, one act of kindness at a time. The next morning, Alex posted a reflection on social media. "Kindness isn't something we do for recognition or reward. It's the thread that connects us, the light that guides us, and the foundation of every strong community. Let's keep spreading it, one small act at a time." The post went viral, sparking conversations across the city about the power of community and the importance of helping one another. Alex's story became a beacon of hope, inspiring others to start their own initiatives and continue the legacy he and Mrs. Parker had built. And so, the seeds of kindness they had planted continued to grow, spreading far beyond Maple Street, proving that one small act of compassion could indeed change the world. Hit that subscribe button to join us in sharing more heartwarming stories that uplift, inspire, and remind us of the goodness in the world. Together, we can make a difference.